My name is Dr. Natalie Vance, and 10 years ago, my life was systematically dismantled by the people who were supposed to protect it. I am currently 34 years old, and if you walked through the sliding glass doors of the Pediatric Trauma unit at Chicago North Memorial, you would see me in a pair of charcoal gray fig scrubs, probably clutching a lukewarm cup of burnt coffee while managing a team of 15 medical professionals. I earn an annual salary of $385,000. I own a 3-bedroom brownstone in Lincoln Park, valued at $1.2 million, and I drive a 2024 Onyx Black Porsche Taycan that I paid for in cash. But in the eyes of the Sterling family of Lake Forest, Illinois, I am nothing more than a ghost, a disgraced felon, and a stain on a $4.2 million legacy that was never intended for someone like me. The hook that tore my life apart was a single, calculated lie. I don't care if she's starving on the street. A gang member doesn't deserve the Sterling name or a single cent of our estate, my brother Caleb had sneered at me on a humid Tuesday afternoon in August. I can still hear the metallic clang of the dumpster lid as he threw my $300 Grey's Anatomy textbooks and my stethoscope into the trash behind a Greyhound station in downtown Chicago. He didn't just throw away my belongings, he threw away my identity. My father, Julian Sterling, stood by the passenger side of his 2014 silver Mercedes S-Class, adjusting his silk tie and looking at me with a cold, detached disappointment that burned worse than Caleb's screaming. My mother, Eleanor, wouldn't even roll down the window of the car. They believed I had been arrested for drug trafficking with a local gang, a narrative Caleb had meticulously crafted by planting stolen goods in my room and forging text messages on an old burner phone. At 24, I was cast out into the gutter with $42 in my pocket and a bruise on my soul that would take a decade to heal. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand the dynamic of the Sterling household. We lived in a sprawling 6-bedroom estate in Lake Forest, where the lawn was mowed twice a week to a precise height of 2.5 inches, and the silence was so thick you could choke on it. My father was a high-level corporate consultant who billed $600 an hour to tell CEOs how to fire people without getting sued. Caleb was the golden boy, the 3-year-older prodigy who followed in my father's footsteps, eventually landing a junior partner position that paid him $200,000 a year by the time he was 27. I was the outlier, the daughter who wanted to touch the blood and grime of medicine rather than the spreadsheets of corporate rating. The contrast between us was a chasm. While Caleb was gifted a brand new BMW for his college graduation, I worked 30 hours a week at a local diner while maintaining a 3.9 GPA in pre-med. My parents viewed my ambition not as a point of pride, but as an inconvenience. They wanted a daughter who would marry a law partner and host charity galas, not someone who came home smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. When Caleb's gambling debts began to spiral out of control during his mid-20s, he realized that the $4.2 million family trust, established by our grandfather, would be split equally between us. He needed that money to disappear his debts to some very dangerous people, and the only way to get my half was to make me invisible. He framed me so convincingly that the police were at our door before I could even explain that I didn't know the people in the photos Caleb had discovered. My father didn't wait for a trial. He didn't hire a lawyer. He simply erased me. Now let me take you back to that Greyhound station. I watched the Mercedes drive away, the exhaust from the German engine puffing out a final insult as they vanished into the city traffic. I didn't cry. I walked to that dumpster, climbed inside, and retrieved my textbooks. They were stained with coffee grounds and mystery liquid, but they were my only way out. For the next 5 years, I worked 3 jobs. I scrubbed floors at a 24-hour gym for $15 an hour. I tutored wealthy high schoolers in chemistry for $75 an hour. And I slept on a floor in a studio apartment in Logan Square where the radiator hissed like a dying animal all winter. I changed my last name to Vance, my grandmother's maiden name, and I disappeared into the grueling, soul-crushing world of medical school and residency. While I was performing emergency craniotomies and stitching up gunshot wounds on toddlers, My family was living their pristine life in the suburbs, convinced I was rotting in a prison cell or dead in a ditch. Caleb had spent 10 years playing the part of the devoted only son, slowly siphoning off the family wealth to cover his tracks. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales in the most violent ways possible. 3 weeks ago, the red phone in the trauma bay rang. It was a clear, crisp Tuesday in Chicago, the kind of day where the wind off Lake Michigan feels like a razor blade. I was standing at the central nursing station, reviewing the blood gas levels of a 6-year-old who had fallen from a 3rd-story balcony. The dispatcher's voice was calm, clinical. "We have a multi-vehicle MVA on I-94. 2 victims incoming. Male, early 30s, entrapped crushed chest syndrome, unstable vitals. Female, late 50s, possible internal hemorrhage. ETA 4 minutes. I prepped my team. We moved with the synchronized grace of a clockwork mechanism. I checked my trauma shears, adjusted my goggles, and waited by the bay doors. When the first ambulance backed in, the paramedics were bagging the patient, their faces grim. As they slid the gurney out, the first thing I saw was the watch on the victim's wrist, a Rolex Submariner with a scratched sapphire crystal. I recognized that watch. I had seen my father give it to Caleb for his 30th birthday. My heart didn't skip a beat. My professional training took over, a cold, crystalline layer of logic settling over my emotions. This man was not my brother. He was a surgical emergency. But when the second ambulance arrived and my mother was wheeled out, her face pale and matted with blood, the 10 years of silence screamed in my ears. She was wearing a Chanel suit that was now shredded and soaked in motor oil and hemoglobin. My father followed in a 3rd vehicle, uninjured but hysterical, his $3,000 suit jacket missing, his shirt stained with the reality of a world he couldn't control. As I stepped forward to lead the resuscitation, my father saw the name embroidered on my white coat, Dr. N. Vance, Chief of Trauma. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and frantic, and for a second, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. He didn't see the gang member Caleb had described. He saw a woman standing at the center of a storm, commanding a room of experts with a flick of her wrist. He saw the daughter he had thrown away like trash, now holding the power of life and death over his golden son. I didn't say a word to him. I turned to the resident and ordered 2 units of O-negative blood and a chest tube tray. My mother's blood pressure was bottoming out, 80/40, and Caleb's heart rate was a tachycardic mess. I spent the next 6 hours in operating room 4. I opened Caleb's chest. I felt his heart in my hands, a muscular organ that had pumped blood through a body capable of such immense cruelty. I repaired the laceration to his hepatic vein, my fingers moving with a precision that cost me 10 years of isolation to master. I worked until my back ached and my eyes burned under the harsh LED surgical lights. When I finally stepped out of the OR, the sun was beginning to rise over the Chicago skyline, painting the skyscrapers in shades of bruised purple and gold. My father was sitting in the waiting room, a space that cost the hospital thousands of dollars to maintain, but felt like a cage to a man of his stature. He looked small. The $4.2 million estate, the Lake Forest reputation, the silk ties, none of it mattered in the face of a grade 4 liver laceration. He stood up when he saw me, his hands shaking. "Natalie?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The name felt strange coming from him, like a word from a dead language. I didn't hug him. I didn't cry. I stood 5 feet away, the scent of his son's blood still faintly clinging to my scrub top. "My name is Dr. Vance," I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor's flatline. "Your son is stable for now, but he's heading to the ICU. Your wife is in recovery. She'll need a follow-up CT scan in 4 hours." He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. He looked at my face, searching for the girl he had abandoned at a Greyhound station. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, a pathetic note of accusation in his tone. "Why did you let us think?" I cut him off. "You chose what to think, Julian. You and Caleb decided who I was without ever asking me. You threw my textbooks in the trash. Those books saved your son's life tonight." I turned and walked away, the squeak of my clogs on the sterile linoleum floor the only sound in the hallway. I went back to my office, sat in my ergonomic chair that cost $900, and looked at a photo on my desk of me at my medical school graduation. I was alone in the photo, smiling into the camera of a stranger I'd asked to take the picture. I had built a kingdom in the silence they gave me, and while they were broken and bleeding, I was whole. Family isn't blood that you share. It isn't a name on a trust fund or a seat at a dinner table in a house full of lies. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out, and the person who does the work when no one is watching. As I watched the heart rate monitors flicker on the screen in my office, I realized that I didn't need their apology or their money. I had already won the only thing that mattered, the truth of who I was, written in the lives I saved every single day. The contrast between the life Caleb was allowed to lead and the one I was forced to forge in the shadows was not just unfair. It was sickening, a visceral manifestation of how easily a lie can be polished until it looks like the truth. While I was scrubbing into my third consecutive 18-hour shift at the hospital, my brother was busy playing the part of the sophisticated heir to the Vance family throne. He lived in the light of my father's unwavering approval, managing the day-to-day operations of Vance and Sons, a commercial landscaping empire based out of Lake Forest that pulled in a staggering $1.2 million in annual net profit. My father, Robert, had built that company from a single used lawnmower into a fleet of 24 custom-painted forest green Ford F550 Super Duty trucks, each equipped with state-of-the-art hydraulic systems and GPS tracking. Caleb didn't have to break a sweat or get his hands dirty in the actual soil. He sat in an executive office with floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing $1,200 Brunello Cucinelli cashmere sweaters in shades of oatmeal and charcoal, sipping double espressos from a Jura Z10 machine that cost nearly $3,000. He was the face of the legacy, the son who stayed, the one who supposedly kept the family name pristine while I was being painted as the monster under the bed. During those same years, my reality was a claustrophobic 320-square-foot studio apartment in a crumbling brick walk up in the medical district, a place where the walls were so thin I could hear the neighbor's television at 3 in the morning and the air always smelled of damp plaster and industrial-strength floor cleaner. My kitchen was a single electric hot plate and a mini fridge that hummed with a persistent, grinding vibration that made it impossible to sleep. To survive the grueling demands of my residency, I existed on 89-cent packets of Maruchan ramen and discounted grocery store apples that were bruised and destined for the trash. I remember sitting on my floor, because I couldn't afford a proper sofa, counting out nickels and dimes just to pay for a laundry load at the basement machines. I was a doctor in training, a woman who was learning how to reattach severed arteries and stabilize shattered pelvises, yet I was living like a fugitive. My hands were steady in the operating room, but they shook when I checked my bank balance and saw it hovering at $12.44. I was the chief of pediatric trauma in the making, but to the world I had left behind, I was a ghost story told to frighten children into obedience. Caleb had not merely outshone me. He had systematically erased me with a level of sociopathic precision that still makes my blood run cold. He knew that my parents, Robert and Martha, valued the family reputation above all else, and he played those insecurities like a master conductor. He didn't just tell them I had dropped out of Johns Hopkins University. He provided what he called the proof. He spent $500 on a high-end Photoshop job to forge a fraudulent police report from the Baltimore Police Department, complete with a fake case number and a meticulously replicated department seal. The document claimed I had been arrested during a narcotics raid on a known gang hideout, alleging that I was the primary distributor for a ring of fentanyl dealers. He even went as far as to create a burner email account to send my mother anonymous tips from a concerned citizen who claimed to have seen me in the company of dangerous men. It was a digital assassination of my character, and because Robert and Martha were so obsessed with the Vance name being associated with excellence, they didn't even call me to ask for my side of the story. They didn't want to hear a daughter's defense. They wanted to protect the brand. The finality of their betrayal is etched into my memory with the permanence of a surgical scar. It happened on November 14th, 2016, at exactly 11:42 p.m. I remember the time because I had just finished a rotation and was standing on the platform of the Blue Line train, my breath hitching in the freezing Chicago air. I had tried to call home to tell my mother about a successful surgery I had assisted on, a small attempt to bridge the distance that had been growing between us. I watched the screen of my iPhone 6 as the call went straight to a busy signal, then tried again only to receive a mechanical recording stating that the number was no longer in service for my caller ID. They hadn't just stopped answering, they had blocked me. They had scrubbed my existence from their cellular plans, their social media, and their lives in one synchronized movement. For 3,650 days, 10 long, agonizing years, they didn't look back once. They never sent a birthday card, never checked to see if I was alive, and never questioned the narrative Caleb had spoon-fed them over Sunday dinners in their granite-topped kitchen. The psychological toll of that silence was heavier than any medical textbook I had ever carried. I spent the first few years of that decade in a state of perpetual mourning, grieving for parents who were still breathing but had chosen to treat me as if I were dead. I would see a 2016 Mercedes S-Class on the street, and my heart would hammer against my ribs, thinking it might be Robert coming to find me, to tell me it was all a mistake. But he never came. Instead, I poured that agony into my work. I became a machine of clinical efficiency. If I didn't have a family, I would have my career. If I didn't have their love, I would have the respect of the surgical community. I climbed the ranks of the hospital with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive. By the time I was 30, I was a senior attending. By 33, I was the youngest chief of pediatric trauma in the history of the institution. I was earning $385,000 a year, and my name was respected in medical journals across the country. Yet in the quiet moments of the night, in my beautiful $1.2 million brownstone with its reclaimed oak floors and designer lighting, I was still that 24-year-old girl standing on the train platform, hearing the silence of a blocked phone line. The irony of the Vance and Sons empire is that it was built on the idea of making things beautiful on the surface, while the roots underneath were rotting. My father's business was a juggernaut in the Illinois landscaping world, securing contracts for multi-million-dollar corporate campuses and private estates where the grass was kept a vibrant, artificial green through a cocktail of expensive chemicals and constant irrigation. Robert was a man who understood the value of a well-groomed hedge, but he had no concept of how to nurture a human soul. He saw Caleb as the sturdy oak, and me as the weed that needed to be extracted and discarded before I could ruin the aesthetic of his perfect life. Martha was no better. She was a woman who lived for the social approval of her country club peers, spending her afternoons at the Lake Forest Club playing bridge and discussing the latest charity auctions. To her, a daughter in a narcotics ring was a social death sentence, a scandal that would have made her the subject of hushed whispers over Chardonnay. It was easier for her to believe the lie than to face the potential embarrassment of a messy truth. Caleb's sweaters were always pristine, never a thread out of place, just like the life he had stolen from me. He took my half of the $4.2 million estate and used it to fuel a lifestyle of high-stakes gambling and offshore investments that my parents were blissfully unaware of. While they praised him for his business acumen and his loyalty to the family firm, he was slowly cannibalizing the very assets they worked so hard to protect. He was the parasite wearing Cusinelli, the golden child who was actually a hollow shell of greed and deception. Every time he sat at that Thanksgiving table, occupying the seat that should have been mine, he was laughing at the simplicity of our parents and the ease with which he had dispatched his only sibling. He thought he had won. He thought that by throwing my textbooks into a dumpster and forging a police report, he had permanently altered the trajectory of my life. He didn't realize that by stripping me of everything, he had made me indestructible. He didn't know that the ramen packets and the cold studio apartment were the forge in which I was being tempered into the surgeon who would eventually have to decide whether or not to let him bleed out on a cold stainless steel table. The hyper-realism of my life now is a sharp contrast to the gray, dismal years of my exile. I wake up in a bedroom that smells of high-end lavender candles and expensive linen, a 2024 black Porsche Taycan waiting in my heated garage, its electric motor silent and powerful. I wear tailored scrubs that cost more than my entire wardrobe did in 2016. I am a woman of substance, of power, and of undeniable skill. And yet, the memory of that 11:42 p.m. timestamp on my phone is a ghost that haunts the periphery of my success. It reminds me that the people who share your blood can be the most dangerous enemies you will ever face. They didn't just fail to love me, they actively participated in my destruction because it was more convenient than the truth. As I prepare for the day, checking the surgical schedule on my iPad Pro, I know that the 3,650 days of silence are finally coming to an end. Not because they found their conscience, but because the golden boy finally broke and they have nowhere else to turn but the ghost they tried to bury. The betrayal hit its absolute peak during the coldest week of January when my grandmother Evelyn finally passed away, taking with her the last shred of warmth that had ever existed in the Vance bloodline. She was the only person who had ever looked at me with anything resembling genuine affection, the only one who didn't measure my worth by the prestige of my zip code or the brand of my shoes. And Caleb knew that her death was the final opportunity to sever my connection to the family once and for all. He orchestrated a deception so cruel that it felt more like a ritual execution of my remaining hope than a simple lie about a schedule. When I called him, my voice trembling from the exhaustion of a double shift and the weight of my grief, he told me with a calculated, steady tone that the funeral service at the Forest Hills Cemetery was set for 10 a.m. sharp. I spent my last $60 on a modest black dress from a thrift store and spent an hour scrubbing the grease off my fingernails, desperate to look presentable for the woman who had once baked me cookies while the rest of the family ignored my existence. I arrived at the cemetery at 9:40 a.m., driving my beat-up 2009 Ford Focus with a rusted quarter panel and a muffler that rattled so loudly it seemed to scream my poverty to the pristine streets of Lake Forest. My breath hitched when I saw the heavy wrought iron gates were already pulled shut and secured with a thick, rusted chain. I checked my watch, the plastic Casio digital display blinking 9:41 a.m., and for a moment, I thought I had the wrong day until I looked across the sprawling, snow-dusted lawn toward the Vance family plot. The service wasn't starting, it was ending. Caleb had lied. The funeral had actually started at 8 a.m., a private early morning affair designed specifically to ensure that the disgrace of the family wouldn't be present to stain the carefully curated image of their mourning. I stood there, clutching the steering wheel of my vibrating car until my knuckles turned white, forced to watch from a distance of 100 yards as my family gathered around the grave. The scene was a masterclass in affluent mourning, a sea of designer wool coats and polished leather boots. I could see my father, Robert, standing tall with his shoulders squared, his hand resting on my mother's arm as she dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. They looked like a portrait of tragic dignity, the pillars of the community grieving their matriarch. And then there was Caleb. He was standing slightly apart from the rest, looking every bit the grieving heir in a custom-tailored black overcoat. As the pallbearers lowered Evelyn's mahogany casket into the frozen earth, Caleb turned his head just enough to spot my rusted Ford idling near the gates. Even from that distance, I could see the glint of his $400 Ray-Ban aviators reflecting the pale winter sun. He didn't look away in shame. He smirked. It was a slow, deliberate expression of triumph, a signal that he had successfully buried my relationship with my parents, along with my grandmother. He leaned in and whispered something into my mother's ear, his lips barely moving as he pointed subtly toward the gate. I watched as Martha turned her head, her face contorting into an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if she were looking at a stray animal scavenging through trash rather than her own flesh and blood. She turned back to the grave immediately, her spine stiffening, effectively erasing me from her field of vision and her heart. The sensory details of that morning are burned into my mind with a clarity that no amount of time can dull. The air was heavy and stagnant, smelling of the damp, raw earth that had been piled beside the grave and the acrid, blue-tinged diesel exhaust from the idling Cadillac hearse that sat nearby. The wind was a biting, unforgiving force that whistled through the gaps in my car's weather stripping, carrying the distant, muffled sound of the priest's final prayer. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just being cast out of the family. I was being systematically erased from their history, rewritten as a villain so that they could play the role of the victims. Every cent of the $4.2 million estate that Evelyn had intended to be shared was now firmly in Caleb's grasp. But it wasn't the money that hurt the most. It was the realization that my parents would rather believe a lie that allowed them to feel superior than face a truth that might require them to feel guilty. I sat in that car, the engine of the Ford Focus sputtering as it struggled to stay running, and I made a silent vow to the woman in that casket. I wouldn't just survive. I would become something so significant that they could never truly forget me, no matter how many gates they locked or how many lies they told. I watched the last of the dirt fall onto the mahogany lid, the thud of the earth echoing in my chest like a closing door. One by one, the relatives began to walk back toward their fleet of luxury vehicles. Range Rovers, Lexuses, and my father's gleaming Mercedes, all of them moving with a rehearsed grace that felt entirely hollow. Not a single person looked back at the gate. Not a single person wondered why the daughter who had spent every summer of her childhood at Evelyn's side wasn't standing there with a handful of lilies. They had been primed by Caleb to see my absence as further proof of my gang involvement and my lack of respect for the family. In their minds, I was probably off in some dark corner of the city, high on the narcotics Caleb had convinced them I sold, while in reality, I was a 24-year-old girl with a stethoscope in her backpack and a heart that was hardening into diamond. I waited until the last car had cleared the driveway, the tires crunching over the salt and ice, before I finally turned my own key in the ignition. The Ford groaned, the fan belt squealing in protest, and I drove away from the only person who had ever truly known me, leaving behind the diesel fumes and the damp earth of a life that was no longer mine to claim. The drive back to my tiny apartment was a blur of gray highway and bitter internal monologue. Every red light felt like a personal insult, every passerby a witness to my humiliation. I thought about the 320-square-foot space that waited for me, the smell of ramen and the sound of the neighbor's radio, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a fortress. If the sterling name was a currency I wasn't allowed to spend, then I would mint my own. I would spend the next decade building a life that had nothing to do with landscaping empires or Brunello Cucinelli sweaters. I would learn the intricacies of the human body, the way a heart can be stopped and started again, the way a shattered bone can be knit back together with titanium and patience. I would become Dr. Natalie Vance, a name that would eventually carry more weight in the halls of Chicago North Memorial than the Vance name ever did in the country clubs of Lake Forest. Caleb had won the battle at the cemetery. He had stolen the inheritance and the affection of our parents, but he had also gifted me the most powerful weapon a person can possess, the absolute lack of anything left to lose. As the years passed and my career began to take flight, the memory of those locked gates served as a recurring phantom in my dreams. I would often wake up at 3 a.m, the silence of my luxury brownstone echoing with the phantom sound of that diesel hearse. I would think about my mother's look of disgust and my father's rigid back, and I would feel a cold, clinical fire ignite in my veins. It was that fire that pushed me through 48-hour shifts, that made me study until my eyes bled, and that allowed me to maintain a steady hand when a child's life was literally leaking through my fingers. I was no longer the girl in the rusted Ford. I was a surgeon who earned $385,000 a year, a woman who had saved more lives than Caleb had told lies. I had replaced the smell of damp earth and exhaust with the scent of surgical scrub and expensive espresso. I had traded the beat-up Focus for a 2024 Porsche Taycan that could outrun any ghost from my past. But despite all the success and the material proof of my survival, that morning at the cemetery remained the anchor of my narrative. It was the moment I realized that family is a choice, not a biological mandate, and that the people who share your DNA are often the ones most capable of leaving you to starve in the cold while they celebrate your disappearance. Now, as I sit in my office with the Chicago skyline twinkling outside my window, I can almost thank Caleb for what he did. Without his cruelty, I might have stayed in Lake Forest, living a mediocre life in the shadow of my father's expectations. I might have married some boring junior partner and spent my days worrying about the height of my hedges and the color of my drapes. Instead, I am a titan in my field. I am the woman who families beg to see when the worst day of their lives arrives. I am the one who decides who lives and who dies in the Pediatric Trauma unit. Caleb thought he was burying me that day, but he didn't realize that I was a seed. He thought he was erasing me, but he was only clearing the canvas so I could paint a masterpiece of my own making. The $4.2 million he fought so hard to steal is a pittance compared to the autonomy I earned in the dirt. He has the money, he has the house, and he has the parents who are willing to believe a monster's lullaby. But he will never have the one thing I possess: a soul that cannot be bought, broken, or blocked by a set of iron gates at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. The moral of my story isn't about forgiveness. It's about the terrifying beauty of being discarded. Because once you are truly forgotten by the world that sought to diminish you, you are finally free to build a world where you are the only authority that matters. The isolation of a hospital cafeteria at 3:15 a.m. is a specific kind of purgatory that only those in the medical profession truly understand. A place where the fluorescent lights hum with a predatory buzz and the air is thick with the scent of floor wax and desperation. I was 26 years old, halfway through a brutal double shift that had already seen 3 trauma admissions and a failed resuscitation, and I was sitting at a chipped Formica table that wobbled every time I shifted my weight. In front of me sat a translucent plastic cup filled with $2.50 worth of burnt, acidic coffee that had likely been sitting in the industrial brewer since midnight. The liquid was dark and oily, reflecting the harsh overhead lighting like a stagnant pool of regret, and as I stared into it, I felt the final threads of my connection to the sterling name snap with a quiet, internal violence. I reached for a coarse, one-ply paper napkin from the dispenser, the metal teeth of the container screeching against the silence of the nearly empty hall, and I pulled a black Pilot G2 pen from my scrub pocket. With a hand that only shook because of the caffeine and the bone-deep exhaustion, I drew a single, uncompromising vertical line down the exact center of that napkin. On the left side of the line, I wrote the words, "Family Loyalty," in a script that looked increasingly alien to me, and on the right side, I scrawled, "Truth and Surgery." I sat there for 20 minutes, the only sound the distant, rhythmic chirping of a heart monitor from the telemetry floor and the hum of a nearby vending machine stocked with overpriced granola bars and stale pretzels. I looked at the left column, searching my memory for a single entry that would justify its existence, a single moment where Robert or Martha had chosen my humanity over Caleb's lies or their own social standing. I looked for the memory of a birthday card that wasn't a formality, a phone call that didn't involve an accusation, or a moment of grace at a cemetery gate that had been slammed shut in my face. The left side of the napkin remained hauntingly, devastatingly empty, a white expanse of nothingness that represented 24 years of wasted effort. On the right side, the list was already overflowing. The successful placement of a neonatal chest tube, the 3.9 GPA I had maintained while starving, the intricate knowledge of the human vascular system, and the undeniable reality that I was capable of saving lives while my family was busy protecting a landscaping empire built on a foundation of deceit. It was in that moment of absolute clarity, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the cold reality of my own solitude, that I made the most important decision of my life. I would never defend myself to them again. I realized that to defend oneself is to acknowledge that the other person's opinion holds power, and I was done giving the Sterlings power over my narrative. I decided that from that second forward, I would let my success be the only evidence of my character. A silent, skyscraper-sized monument that they would eventually be forced to look at whether they wanted to or not. I would no longer beg for a seat at a table that was set with poison, nor would I waste my precious oxygen explaining that I wasn't a narcotics dealer to people who found it more profitable to believe I was a criminal. I stood up, left the cold coffee untouched, and crumpled the napkin into a small, tight ball before flicking it into the gray industrial trash can. I walked back toward the surgical wing, each step on the linoleum floor sounding like a nail being driven into the coffin of my former life, and I began the process of burying the Sterling identity in a shallow, unceremonious grave. The technical execution of my disappearance was as precise as an incision. The very next morning, after only 3 hours of sleep on a lumpy mattress in the on-call room, I began the legal process of changing my last name. I shed the name Sterling, a name that tasted like copper and old money, and I legally adopted my mother's maiden name, Vance, though I did it not to honor her, but to reclaim a piece of history that preceded her surrender to my father's will. I spent $350 on filing fees and court costs, a sum that felt like a fortune at the time, but was the cheapest price I had ever paid for freedom. I watched the court clerk stamp the paperwork with a heavy, ink-stained seal, and as the name, Doctor. Natalie Vance appeared on the official documentation. I felt a physical weight lift from my chest. I wasn't just a doctor anymore. I was a woman who had successfully performed a self-amputation, removing the gangrenous limb of my family history so that the rest of my soul could survive. I stopped trying to call the house in Lake Forest. I deleted their numbers from my contacts, and I blocked the email addresses that had only ever delivered vitriol. I became a ghost to them, a whisper of a memory that they could safely ignore while they celebrated Caleb's mediocre achievements in their $1,200 sweaters. For the next 8 years, the Sterling identity stayed buried, while Natalie Vance rose through the ranks of the Chicago medical world like a force of nature. I worked with a level of intensity that made my colleagues both admire and fear me. I didn't take vacations to the Hamptons or spend my weekends at country clubs. I spent them in the lab, studying the latest advancements in pediatric trauma and perfecting my surgical technique on cadavers until my hands could move in the dark. I moved from my 320-square-foot studio into a slightly larger one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, then eventually into the $1.2 million brownstone I occupy now, a home filled with custom walnut shelving, a sub-zero refrigerator that cost $15,000, and a peace of mind that no amount of inheritance could ever buy. I curated a life that was hyper-specific and entirely my own, from the 2024 Onyx Black Porsche Taycan in my garage to the collection of rare medical texts that lined my office walls. Every time I signed a chart or a mortgage document with the name Vance, I felt a quiet surge of triumph. I had built a kingdom in the silence they gave me, and I had done it without a single cent of their $4.2 million estate. I lived in a world of technical specifications and objective truths. I knew that a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country had a curb weight of approximately 5,800 pounds, and that the impact of such a vehicle at 60 miles per hour would cause specific, predictable patterns of blunt force trauma to the human torso. I knew the exact cost of a single hour of time in an operating room, approximately $62 per minute, and I knew that my own time was now valued at nearly $400,000 a year. These were the metrics that mattered, not the forged police reports or the smirk on Caleb's face behind his Ray-Bans. I had replaced the emotional chaos of the Sterling household with the rigorous, beautiful logic of medicine. While Caleb was likely navigating the complexities of his gambling debts, and my father was worrying about the pH balance of the soil on a corporate campus in Naperville, I was navigating the delicate architecture of a child's heart. I was the person people called when the world was falling apart, the one who stepped into the chaos and brought order through the sheer force of my expertise. The transition from the ghost of the family to the chief of pediatric trauma was not a path paved with forgiveness, but with a cold, unrelenting fire. I remember one particular night, about 4 years into my self-imposed exile, when I was sitting in my car after a particularly grueling shift. It was raining, a heavy, gray Midwestern downpour that blurred the lights of the Chicago skyline. I looked at my hands, the same hands that my father had once dismissed as being too weak for the real world of business, and I realized they were covered in the faint scent of surgical soap and success. I didn't miss the 4,000-square-foot colonial on Briarwood Lane. I didn't miss the Sunday dinners where the silence was a weapon. I missed the girl I used to be, the one who thought she needed their approval to be whole, but even that version of me was fading into a distant, grainy memory. I had become something harder, sharper, and infinitely more valuable. I was the surgeon who could stay calm while a room full of people panicked, the woman who had survived a 10-year blackout and come out the other side with a light of her own. Caleb's betrayal had been intended to keep me small, to ensure that I would always be the deadbeat sister who couldn't be trusted with the family legacy. He had used a $500 Photoshop job to try and define the rest of my life, never realizing that he was actually handing me the keys to my own evolution. By forcing me to change my name and abandon my identity, he had inadvertently stripped away every distraction and every obligation that might have held me back. I was free to become whoever I wanted to be, and I chose to be the best. I chose to be the person who 10 years later would stand in a trauma bay and watch that same brother be wheeled in, broken and bleeding from the very world he had tried so hard to dominate. As I looked at that napkin in the cafeteria at 3:15 a.m., I didn't see a tragedy. I saw a blueprint. I saw the line that separated the past from the future, and I saw that the right side of the page was the only place I ever truly belonged. The Sterling name was a heavy, tarnished chain, but the Vance name was a scalpel, clean, precise, and capable of cutting through the lies to reach the truth beneath. And that truth was simple. I didn't need them to believe in me for me to exist, and I didn't need their love to be magnificent. I just needed the truth, and a steady hand, and the courage to leave the coffee behind and walk back into the light of the operating room. The date was October 23, 2025, a Friday night that began with the kind of oppressive humidity that usually precedes a violent Midwestern thunderstorm. At exactly 9:22 p.m., I was standing in the surgical lounge of Chicago North Memorial, a space that smelled of ozone and the sterile, metallic scent of high-grade air filtration systems. I had just finished a double espresso, the caffeine barely touching the edges of a 36-hour fatigue, when the overhead intercom crackled to life with a sound that still makes the hair on my arms stand up. "Code Red, Pediatric Trauma, Bay 3, ETA 4 minutes, the dispatcher's voice announced, her tone a practiced mask of professional detachment. The details followed in a rapid-fire burst over my encrypted pager. A 6-year-old female, blunt force trauma, an unrestrained passenger in a high-speed vehicle collision involving a black SUV and a concrete pylon on I-94. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my paper cup into the bin and moved toward the trauma bay, my clogs squeaking rhythmically against the polished linoleum floor as my mind began to categorize the potential injuries. Splenic rupture, intracranial hemorrhage, flail chest, the grim architecture of a child's body breaking under the physics of a 60-mile-per-hour impact. I spent the next 240 seconds preparing the room with a clinical intensity that left no room for thought or emotion. I checked the suction lines, ensured the rapid infuser was primed with warmed O-negative blood, and laid out the chest tube tray on the stainless steel Mayo stand. My team moved around me like a well-oiled machine, 4 nurses and 2 junior residents who looked to me for the signal to begin. We were a fortress of expertise, standing in a room illuminated by 4,000 lumen surgical LEDs, waiting for the chaos to arrive. When the double doors finally burst open, the sound was like a physical blow, a violent eruption of noise and heat from the hallway that shattered the pressurized silence of the bay. The paramedics were running, their boots pounding a frantic beat as they pushed a gurney carrying a small, motionless figure whose pale skin was a terrifying contrast to the saturated crimson of the trauma blanket. But it wasn't the patient who stopped my heart. It was the man trailing behind the gurney, his face a mask of primal, incoherent terror. It was my brother, Caleb. He was covered in a spray of fine, mist-like blood that had soaked into the fibers of his light-tan Brunello Cucinelli overcoat, his hair disheveled and his eyes wide with a manic, flickering light. He was screaming, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the sterile air of the trauma bay, his hands reaching out toward the child as if he could pull her back from the edge of the abyss through sheer volume alone. Behind him, emerging from the shadows of the corridor like ghosts from a past I had successfully buried, were my parents, Robert and Martha. They were dressed for a high-end gala, my father in a charcoal bespoke suit and my mother in a tailored silk dress, but the elegance of their attire was rendered grotesque by the situation. For a split second, the professional barrier I had spent 10 years constructing threatened to liquefy, but I clamped down on the impulse with a ferocity that tasted like iron in the back of my throat. I was no longer the daughter they had discarded. I was the chief of pediatric trauma, and this room was my sovereign territory. As I stepped into the light of the primary survey area, the movement caught my father's eye. He looked up from the gurney, his mouth opening to demand something of the staff, but the words died in his throat as his gaze locked onto mine. I was standing there in my charcoal gray fig scrubs, my white coat pristine and heavy with the weight of my authority, and the gold-bordered badge on my lapel glinted under the lights. Dr. Natalie Vance, Chief of Trauma. The transformation in his expression was instantaneous and visceral. His face went a specific shade of gray, not the pale of a fright, but the deep ashen gray of a morgue slab, a color that signaled the total collapse of his reality. Beside him, my mother's eyes went wide, her pupils dilating until they nearly swallowed the irises. The shock was so profound that her $5,000 midnight black Chanel handbag, which she had been clutching with white-knuckled desperation, slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a heavy, muffled thud, the gold chain rattling against the floor like a funeral bell. But she didn't even notice. The silence that followed was a vacuum, a pocket of frozen time where the 10 years of lies, the forged police reports, the locked cemetery gates, and the 3,650 days of silence all collided in a single agonizing moment of recognition. They weren't looking at a felon or a drug dealer. They were looking at the only person in the city of Chicago capable of keeping that little girl's heart beating. Caleb stopped screaming mid-breath, his hand frozen in the air, his gaze darting from my face to the name embroidered in navy blue silk on my chest. The irony was a jagged blade. The deadbeat sister he had tried to erase was now the goddess of the very altar he was forced to pray at. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a greeting, nor did I allow a single flicker of recognition to soften my features. I looked through them as if they were made of glass, my voice cutting through the tension with the cold, sharp precision of a number 10 blade. "Step back behind the red line now," I commanded, my voice projecting with a level of authority that allowed for no negotiation. My father tried to speak, his lips trembling as he reached out a hand, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to claim a kinship he had forfeited a decade ago. But I didn't let him finish. "I don't care who you are, get behind the line or security will remove you from this bay," I snapped, turning my back on them to focus on the small girl on the table. She was his daughter, my niece, a child I didn't even know existed, a tiny life named Sophia whose vitals were crashing in front of my eyes. Her blood pressure was 60/30. Her heart rate was a thready 160, and the ultrasound probe was already showing a massive amount of free fluid in her abdomen. The contrast was sickening. While they had spent the last decade polishing their reputation in Lake Forest, they had failed to even buckle this child into a car seat, a negligence that had led to this catastrophic internal slaughter. The room erupted into a frenzy of clinical activity as I called for a double-lumen intubation kit and ordered the activation of the massive transfusion protocol. I was aware of them watching from the periphery, 3 broken figures huddled together behind the red tape, forced to witness the reality of who I had become in the dark. I could feel Martha's eyes burning into my back, her silent tears drenching her silk collar, and I could hear Robert's ragged, uneven breathing as he realized the magnitude of his failure. They were seeing the hyper-real version of the daughter they had traded for a lie. Every movement I made was a testament to the thousands of hours I had spent in the shadows. Every command I gave was a reflection of the strength I had gathered from their abandonment. I wasn't just saving a child. I was demonstrating the absolute, undeniable truth of my existence. As I worked, the sensory details of the room became heightened to a point of near hallucination. I could smell the acrid scent of Caleb's expensive cologne mixing with the copper tang of the blood on the table. I could hear the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the ventilator and the insistent, high-pitched alarm of the cardiac monitor. I felt the cool, latex-covered pressure of Sophia's small hand as I checked her brachial pulse, a reminder of the fragility of the life that Caleb had nearly snuffed out with his black SUV. Every time I glanced at the monitor, I was aware of the $42 million legacy that they had fought so hard to keep from me, and how utterly worthless it was in this 12 by 12 room. You cannot bribe a ruptured liver, and you cannot use a Cusinelli sweater to pack a hemorrhaging wound. In this space, the only currency that mattered was my skill, and I was the wealthiest person in the building. The moral weight of the moment was a crushing force, yet it gave me a strange, crystalline peace. Family is not the people who share your DNA but discard your soul. Family is the commitment to the truth, even when it is ugly. I looked at the 3 of them, the father who blocked my number, the mother who turned away in disgust, and the brother who threw my life into a dumpster. And I realized that I felt nothing but a profound, clinical pity. They were small people who had played a small game, and now they were facing the ultimate consequence of their superficiality. I spent the next 4 hours in a high-stakes ballet of life and death, my hands deep inside the chest cavity of a child who carried the blood of my enemies, while they waited in the hallway, forced to endure the same agonizing silence they had gifted me for 10 years. When the surgery was finally over, and Sophia was stable enough to be moved to the PICU, I stepped out into the hallway. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving a hollow, aching cold in its wake. My parents were sitting on the plastic chairs, their faces still that haunting shade of gray, their designer clothes wrinkled and stained. Caleb was pacing, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even hold a glass of water. They all stood up as I approached, their eyes searching mine for a sign of the girl they used to know. But that girl died at a Greyhound station in 2015. I looked at them, my expression as unyielding as the titanium plates I had just used to reconstruct their granddaughter's ribs, and I felt the finality of the circle closing. I didn't need their words, and I certainly didn't need their money. I had performed the ultimate surgery. I had saved their future while proving that they no longer had any part in mine. I turned away, the sound of my clogs on the floor the final punctuation on a decade of silence, leaving them alone with the heavy, expensive thud of a Chanel bag that no longer had anything of value to hold. The clock on the wall of the surgical intensive care unit indicated that exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes had passed since I first made the primary incision into the small, fragile chest of the girl who carried my stolen legacy in her veins. My hands, encased in size 6 sterile latex gloves that were now dusted with a fine layer of dried saline and the physical weight of exhaustion, had not faltered once as I navigated the catastrophic landscape of a grade 4 liver laceration. I had worked with a near supernatural focus, using a combination of Pringle maneuvers and meticulously placed horizontal mattress sutures to stop a massive internal hemorrhage that had threatened to drain the life out of Sophia before her 7th birthday. I had stood under the relentless, heatless glare of the surgical LEDs, my back aching and my neck stiff, repairing the damage caused by Caleb's negligence with the very skills my family had claimed I was too criminal to possess. When the final internal stitch was tied and the last drain was placed, I watched the cardiac monitor settle into a rhythmic, reassuring gallop of 84 beats per minute. Only then did I allow myself to step back, strip off my blood-splattered gown, and begin the long, cold walk toward the waiting room where the ghosts of my past were gathered like vultures. As the automatic double doors hissed open, I was met with a wall of sound and the oppressive scent of floral perfumes and expensive wool coats. The waiting room was packed with 42 people, a sea of faces that I hadn't seen in 3,650 days. There were the Sterlings, of course, huddled together in the front row of plastic and chrome chairs, but surrounding them were the pillars of the Lake Forest community. Old family friends, country club associates, and business partners who had all toasted to my disgrace a decade ago. The moment I stepped into the room, a hush fell over the crowd, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that usually precedes a verdict in a capital murder trial. My white coat, embroidered with the title Chief of Pediatric Trauma, felt like a suit of armor as I moved through the center of the room. Caleb was the first to react. He scrambled to his feet, his tan Cusinelli overcoat now wrinkled and stained with the reality of the night, and he lurched toward me with his arms outstretched, a sob breaking from his throat as he cried out about family and the miracle of our reunion. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. As he closed the distance, I stepped back with a sharp, lateral movement, maintaining exactly 4 feet of distance between us, the precise length of the void he had created between me and my life in 2015. I didn't smile, and I certainly didn't cry. My tear ducts felt as dry as the desert air, cauterized by years of surviving on 89-cent ramen and the cold comfort of my own success. I looked at him, seeing not a brother, but a man who had used a $500 Photoshop job to murder my reputation, and I felt a profound sense of clinical detachment. I reached into the side pocket of my leather briefcase, which I had retrieved from my office, and pulled out a heavy, standard-issue manila folder. I could feel the eyes of 42 people burning into me, my mother's desperate, tear-streaked gaze, my father's ashen face, and the judgmental stares of people who had believed the worst of me without a second thought. I stood my ground, my posture as rigid and uncompromising as a spinal fusion rod. Before we discuss Sophia's 14-day post-operative recovery plan or the specific neurological milestones she needs to hit to avoid permanent deficit, let's discuss the 10 years of lies that brought us to this moment, I said. My voice was a marvel of technical precision, as cold and sharp as a surgical blade, carrying to every corner of the crowded room without the need for a microphone. Caleb's hands dropped to his sides, his face flickering from faux grief to a sudden jagged terror as he realized that the deadbeat sister he thought he could manipulate with a hug was gone. I opened the folder, and the first thing I pulled out was a high-resolution printout of the forged police report he had used to convince my parents I was a narcotics trafficker. I held it up so the overhead lights caught the amateurish pixels of the Baltimore Police Department seal, the evidence of his $500 betrayal laid bare for the entire Lake Forest social circle to see. I walked toward my father, Robert, who was sitting with his head in his hands. I didn't offer him comfort. I offered him the truth. This is the document you used to justify blocking my number at 11:42 p.m. on November 14, 2016, I stated, dropping the paper into his lap as if it were a biohazard. It's a forgery, Dad. A cheap digital lie created by the son you've been grooming to take over Vance and Sons. While you were celebrating your $1.2 million annual profits, I was living in a 300-square-foot studio, earning my way through a residency you said I'd dropped out of. I moved to my mother, Martha, who was still clutching the empty air where her $5,000 Chanel bag had been. And you, Mom, you turned your head away at Grandma Evelyn's funeral because Caleb told you the service started at 10 when he knew it was at 8. You let me stand outside a locked gate while you buried the only person who actually loved me. The room was so silent you could hear the hum of the HVAC system and the distant, muffled sirens of an incoming ambulance. I felt the weight of the moral summary I was about to deliver, the final diagnosis of a family that had been rotting from the inside out for a decade. I looked at Caleb, who was now backed against a vending machine, his eyes darting toward the exit. "You spent 10 years siphoning off the family trust to cover your gambling debts, painting me as the criminal so no one would look at your ledgers," I said, pulling out the bank statements I had spent the last week quietly acquiring through my own private investigators. "You didn't just steal my inheritance, you tried to steal my soul. But medicine teaches you one thing very clearly. You cannot heal a wound that is full of necrotic tissue. You have to debride it. You have to cut the rot away before the body can survive." I took a deep breath, the sterile air of the hospital filling my lungs, and I felt the finality of the moment settle over me like a heavy lead apron in a radiology suite. "Family isn't a biological default, and it isn't a name on a landscaping truck or a trust fund," I said, addressing the entire room, my gaze lingering on the family friends who had turned their backs on me. "Family is the person who stays when the lights go out. Family is the truth that survives when the lies are stripped away. For 10 years, I was a ghost because it was more convenient for you to believe a monster's story than to do the work of loving a daughter who didn't fit your mold. Tonight, I saved your future because it's my job and because I am a Vance, the kind of Vance that actually builds things rather than just maintaining the appearance of them. But do not mistake my professional competence for forgiveness." I closed the manila folder with a decisive snap that echoed like a gunshot. I handed a second, smaller document to my father, a list of Sophia's medication schedules, the contact information for the Pediatric Neurorehabilitation Team, and the strict visitation hours for the PICU. "You will follow these instructions to the letter," I commanded, my voice regaining its clinical authority. "You will not deviate. You will not try to contact me outside of medical updates. And Caleb, if I see you in my hospital after your daughter is discharged, I will have security escort you out in the same way you escorted my life into a dumpster 10 years ago." I turned on my heel, the fabric of my white coat swishing against my legs, and I began to walk away. I could hear my mother finally break into true, sobbing wails, the sound of a woman realizing she had traded a diamond for a handful of gravel. I heard my father call my name, a broken, pleading sound that sought a redemption I had no intention of granting. I didn't look back. I walked through the double doors, back into the quiet, blue-tinged hallway of the surgical wing. I passed the nursing station where the staff looked at me with a new kind of reverence, having witnessed the chief of trauma dismantle a legacy in 4 minutes. I went to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the Chicago skyline, the Sears Tower and the Hancock Building glowing like beacons against the dark velvet of the night. I felt the cold, hard weight of my success and the absolute, terrifying freedom of being truly alone. The hyper-realism of the moment was almost too much to bear. I could feel the texture of the wall, the faint vibration of the hospital's generators beneath my feet, and the sharp, clean scent of the hand sanitizer on my skin. I had done the work. I had faced the monster and I hadn't blinked. I realized that the $4.2 million estate and the $1,200 sweaters were just props in a play that had finally closed its curtains. I was Dr. Natalie Vance, and my life didn't belong to Robert, Martha, or Caleb anymore. It belonged to the children I saved, the residents I taught, and the woman I had become in the dark, cold corners of that 320-square-foot studio. As I watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon of Lake Michigan, I knew that the moral of my story was written in the silence that followed my departure. Family is who stays, and since they had all left me a decade ago, I was finally free to choose a family of my own, one built on the truth, one stitch at a time. I didn't argue with the stammering excuses that began to leak from my father's trembling lips, nor did I raise my voice to drown out the pathetic, high-pitched whimpers coming from Caleb as he realized the walls of his carefully constructed kingdom were finally collapsing into the dust. Instead, I moved with the cold, methodical efficiency of a surgeon preparing a sterile field, reaching into the heavy manila folder and handing out physical copies of the truth to my parents and the circle of stunned family friends who stood like statues in the harsh fluorescent glow of the waiting room. Page 1 was a high-resolution, embossed copy of my 2018 medical degree from Johns Hopkins University, featuring the gold seal that Caleb's amateur Photoshop skills could never hope to replicate, and clearly stating my graduation with a 3.9 GPA and honors in trauma surgery. I watched as my father's eyes tracked the dates on the parchment, the realization hitting him that while he was telling the neighbors his daughter was a drug mule, I was actually being hooded by some of the greatest medical minds in the Western world. I didn't give him a moment to process the shame before I slapped page 2 onto the small coffee table in front of him. A detailed 40-page private investigator's report I had commissioned in 2022 when I first suspected why Caleb was so desperate to keep me away from the family books. The report was a forensic nightmare for my brother, containing time-stamped surveillance photos and digital ledger entries showing that Caleb had embezzled exactly $214,000 from Vance and Sons over a 36-month period to cover his spiraling gambling debts at the Horseshoe Casino in Hammond, Indiana. I pointed to the specific line items where he had disguised the withdrawals as equipment maintenance for the fleet of Ford F550 trucks, a move so transparent that even a cursory audit would have caught it if my father hadn't been blinded by his own favoritism. The silence in the waiting room became something physical, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to dim the lights, leaving only the low-frequency hum of the nearby snack vending machine and the rhythmic, distant beep of a floor polisher in the hallway. Finally, I revealed page 3, the original unedited email thread from 2016 that I had recovered from a legacy server, showing Caleb's direct communication with a shady digital fixer to create the forged police contact that had been used to assassinate my character. My father, Robert, looked at the documents with the hollow, vacant stare of a man watching his entire legacy burn to the ground, his gaze darting from the clinical proof of my success to the forensic proof of Caleb's betrayal, and then finally back to me. His face was a map of devastation, the ashen gray of his skin deepening into a sickly, bruised purple as his throat worked, trying to find the words to bridge a 10-year chasm that was simply too wide to cross. He tried to speak, his hand reaching out in a tentative, shaking gesture toward the sleeve of my white coat, but I held up a single gloved hand, stopping him in his tracks with a gesture that was as final as a flatline on a monitor. I did not want his apologies. I did not want his tears, and I certainly did not want the suffocating weight of his belated recognition. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency that carried the absolute weight of my autonomy, cutting through the thick atmosphere of the room like a laser through soft tissue. "That girl died on the platform of the Blue Line train in 2016 while you were busy deleting her from your life, and she was buried for good at a cemetery gate while you watched a casket go into the ground without her. I am not a Sterling. I am not a ghost, and I am certainly not a pawn in your family's theater of appearances. I am the surgeon who just spent 6 hours and 14 minutes holding your granddaughter's shattered liver together with my bare hands, and I am the only reason you aren't planning a second funeral this week." I stood there, the Chief of Trauma badge on my chest catching the light, a reminder that I had earned my place in the world through blood, sweat, and thousands of hours of solitary study while they were playing at being royalty in Lake Forest. The contrast between the woman I had become and the broken people standing before me was sickeningly clear in the silence. My mother, Martha, was still staring at the medical degree as if it were an ancient artifact from a civilization she didn't recognize, her fingers tracing the embossed gold seal while silent, hot tears ruined the finish on her silk dress. Caleb had retreated into the corner near the elevators, his shoulders hunched, the golden boy finally revealed as a common thief and a coward who had traded his sister's life for a few more rounds at a craps table. I looked at them and felt no surge of triumph, only a cold, crystalline sense of completion. The debt was being settled, but not through forgiveness. It was being settled through the cold, hard metrics of the professional world they valued so highly. My father finally found his voice, a ragged, broken whisper that barely climbed above the hum of the room. "Natalie, please, we didn't know. We were told. We can make this right. The estate, your share. It's all there. We'll fix it today." He was offering me the $4.2 million inheritance like it was a Band-Aid for a decapitation, failing to understand that I had built a life where his money was nothing more than paper. I didn't need his estate. I owned a $1.2 million brownstone and earned nearly $400,000 a year on my own merit. I looked at him with a clinical detachment that I usually reserved for reviewing pathology reports, my eyes devoid of the warmth he was so desperately searching for. "I don't want your share of the estate, Robert, and I don't want your seat at the Thanksgiving table," I replied, my words measured and lethal. "I am a private consultant now, and since you've insisted on treating me like a stranger for a decade, I will hold you to the same standard as any other high-profile client who requires my specialized expertise. My bill for this private consultation, the emergency surgery, and the ongoing trauma management is $1,500 an hour, and my administrative assistant will be sending the itemized invoice to Vance and Sons by Monday morning. You will pay it in full, not as a father, but as a customer of the best pediatric trauma unit in the Midwest." I turned my back on him then, the sound of my clogs on the linoleum the only punctuation to the conversation, as I began to walk toward the secure doors of the surgical wing. I could feel the shock waves of my statement rippling through the 42 people in the room, the hushed whispers of family friends who had just witnessed the total disintegration of the Vance family mythos. I didn't care about their gossip or their judgment. I only cared about the steady, rhythmic beat of the heart monitor in the PICU where Sophia was sleeping. As I reached the doors, I paused for a split second, feeling the cold air of the hallway beyond. I had spent 10 years mourning the loss of a family that never really existed, chasing the ghost of a loyalty that was easily bought and sold by a brother with a gambling problem. In this room, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and the sound of sobbing, I realized that I was finally, truly free. The manila folder was empty, the truth was on the table, and the bill was coming due. The hyper-realism of the moment was overwhelming, the way the light glinted off the polished brass of the elevator doors, the specific chemical scent of the floor wax, and the weight of the stethoscope around my neck. I was a woman of substance, defined not by who had abandoned me, but by who I had saved. I walked through the doors and into the quiet sanctuary of the hospital, leaving the Sterlings to drown in the shallow grave they had dug for me 10 years ago. They had wanted a daughter they could control, a daughter who fit their polished, commercial landscaping aesthetic, but they had ended up with a surgeon who knew exactly how to cut away the dead weight. As I moved toward the locker room to finally change out of my blood-stained scrubs, I felt the finality of the moral lesson I had lived. You can block a number, you can forge a report, and you can lock a cemetery gate, but you can never stop the truth from eventually demanding its payment, and my price was higher than any of them could ever afford to pay. The aftermath of that confrontation was not a slow decline, but a total, catastrophic collapse of the pristine, golden life my family had spent decades meticulously curating at the expense of my sanity. On the following Monday morning, at exactly 8:01 a.m., my father sat in his executive office at the Vance and Sons headquarters, surrounded by the smell of expensive leather and mahogany, and officially terminated Caleb's employment. There was no severance package, no hushed agreement to keep things quiet, and no final handshake. There was only the cold, hard reality of a father finally seeing the parasite that had been feeding on his legacy. Caleb was escorted from the building by the very security team he used to command, his hands empty and his reputation in tatters. Currently, he is the subject of a high-stakes civil litigation suit as my father's lawyers move to recover the missing $214,000 he embezzled to fuel his nights at the Horseshoe Casino. The man who once wore $1,200 Brunello Cucinelli sweaters and drove a luxury German SUV is now living in a damp, $900 a month basement suite in a part of the city he used to mock, surviving on the same desperation he once tried to condemn me to. He is a man who traded a sister for a seat at a craps table, and the universe has finally collected on his debt with a crushing interest rate. The dynamic of my relationship with my parents, Robert and Martha, has shifted from a decade of silence to a relentless, pathetic pursuit of a reconciliation I have no intention of granting. They now send me between 5 and 10 emails every single week, their subject lines ranging from "please read" to "family dinner this Sunday," filled with the kind of desperate, late-stage apologies that only come when the golden child has been exposed as a fraud. I do not read them. I do not hover my mouse over the text to catch a glimpse of their regret. At exactly 6 p.m. every evening, I open my laptop and bulk delete their messages without a single flicker of hesitation, the digital trash can chiming with a sound that feels more like a victory than a loss. They want the daughter they discarded to come back and fill the hole left by the son they had to exile, but they fail to realize that I am no longer a piece of furniture they can rearrange to make their living room look better. I am a woman who built her own house, stone by stone, in the freezing cold of their indifference, and I have no room at my table for people who only value me because their first choice turned out to be a thief. My life now is defined by a level of luxury and peace that they can only observe from the outside. A hyper-real existence where the only person I am required to answer to is myself. I live in a 34th-floor penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that offer an unobstructed, breathtaking view of Lake Michigan, a view that changes from a shimmering sapphire in the morning to a deep, bruised indigo at night. My home is a sanctuary of minimalist design and high-end technology, from the custom Italian marble countertops in my kitchen to the silent, automated climate control system that keeps the air at a perfect 72 degrees. I earn a salary that places me in the top fraction of a percent of earners in this country, and I spend it on things that bring me a quiet, solitary joy. A collection of rare first-edition medical journals, a cellar of vintage wines that cost more than Caleb's monthly rent, and the 2024 Onyx Black Porsche Taycan that I drive through the city with a sense of absolute, unshakable autonomy. I am the chief of Pediatric Trauma, a titan in my field, and the name Dr. Natalie Vance carries a weight of respect that the sterling name never could have achieved in its most polished days. The contrast between my current reality and the basement suite where Caleb now resides is a moral lesson written in the language of architecture and finance. While he is listening to the hum of a neighbor's furnace and staring at water stains on a low ceiling, I am watching the sunrise over the lake from a balcony that cost more than his entire landscaping career. I remember the smell of the Greyhound station and the damp earth of the cemetery, and I use those memories as a foundation for the life I lead now. Every time I sign a surgical chart or authorize $1 million equipment purchase for my department, I am reminded that the golden child was nothing more than a lead weight painted in a thin layer of glitter. Caleb tried to destroy my life because he was terrified of his own mediocrity, and my parents allowed it because they were too cowardly to look beneath the surface of their own pride. Now, they are left with the silence they once forced upon me, while I am surrounded by the vibrant, pulsing energy of a life I earned through sheer, unadulterated will. The psychological landscape of my daily life is one of clinical precision and emotional iron. I wake up at 4:30 a.m., the city lights still twinkling below like fallen stars, and I practice a routine of self-discipline that leaves no room for the ghosts of Lake Forest. I drink a cup of coffee that costs $15 a bag, brewed in a machine that mimics the exact pressure of a professional espresso bar, and I prepare for a day where I will decide the fate of children whose families actually love them. There is a profound, terrifying beauty in knowing that you are the architect of your own salvation. I don't need my father's $4.2 million estate because I have created a wealth that cannot be liquidated by a gambling debt or erased by a forged document. I have the wealth of expertise, the capital of a clean conscience, and the ultimate luxury of a life where no one can tell me who I am. When I look at the manila folder that still sits in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one containing the evidence of Caleb's betrayal and my own academic triumphs, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel the same thing I feel when I look at a successfully healed surgical scar, a recognition of past trauma and an appreciation for the strength of the tissue that grew back in its place. The golden child tried to bury me, but he didn't realize that I was the kind of seed that thrives in the dark. He thought he was throwing my life into a dumpster, but he was actually just clearing away the clutter so I could see the path to the trauma bay. My parents' emails are just digital noise, a static frequency that I have learned to tune out in favor of the rhythmic, life-affirming beep of the monitors in my unit. They are the ones who are now ghosts, haunting a house in Lake Forest that feels too big for two people who realized they raised a monster and discarded a hero. The moral of this story is not about the sweetness of revenge, but about the terrifying, magnificent power of setting a boundary that cannot be breached. Family is not a contract you are born into. It is a privilege that must be earned through loyalty, truth, and the courage to stand by someone when the world is screaming lies. My biological family failed every single one of those tests, and so they have been removed from the roster of my life with the same finality as a necrotic organ. I answer to the truth of my skills, the ethics of my profession, and the woman I see in the mirror every morning, a woman who survived the best efforts of her own blood to diminish her. I am Dr. Natalie Vance, and the view from my penthouse is clear, wide, and entirely mine. The Sterling legacy is a pile of ash in a Lake Forest fireplace, but the Vance name is written in the survival of every child who leaves my operating room. I have found the only family that matters, the one I built for myself, out of the scraps of a life they thought was trash, and it is a masterpiece of resilience that no one will ever be able to take away from me. As I sit here tonight, the wind from the lake whispering against the triple-paned glass of my window, I think about the 11:42 p.m. timestamp from 2016. It used to be the time my heart broke, but now it's just a number on a clock, a reminder of the exact moment I began to become indestructible. I have no more questions to ask them, no more defenses to mount, and no more rooms to scrub. I am whole, I am successful, and I am finally, blissfully, alone with my own greatness. The golden child is in the basement. The parents are at an empty table, and the daughter they erased is the only one who truly knows how to live. This is the end of the story they tried to write for me, and the beginning of the one I have been writing for myself since the day the gates locked. It is a story of blood and surgery, of cold coffee and penthouse views, but above all, it is a story of a woman who chose herself when no one else would. Family is who stays, and I am the only one who stayed for me, which makes me the most loyal family I have ever had.